They say tanking is easy, just wall-to-wall pull, it's easy Dzemael, but is that always true? Indeed, there are a lot of large AoE, area of effect, pulls that can be done very easily, even without being very skilled as a tank. But there are also some that are so insane that even while saying tanking is easy and that you can wall-to-wall pull, a large number of players would still advise against certain pulls that are simply too hard. I've compiled some of these types of pulls in this list, although simply in order of level requirement, as I feel the massive variance in what makes each of these pulls so hard or ridiculous makes them unfair to grade against each other. Nonetheless, I have found 10. I will count them down from 10 because I know some people find it more exciting that way. I will also try to refrain from reiterating pulls that I mentioned in my previous video on this subject, even if I would have deemed them to qualify, to avoid repeating myself too much. With that said, do make sure to leave a comment with what you think is the most insane wall-to-wall pull in Final Fantasy XIV. And yes, a pull that you absolutely wouldn't do for any reason normally is also fine. Number 10. Sastasha. A common issue with A Realm Reborn dungeons is that they tend to not have very many walls. This means that you can actually pull everything from the start of Sastasha up to the first boss, and if people press the right choral, it should even be possible to spawn and fight the boss alongside everything else leading up to it. Add to this that most jobs hardly have any tools in this level range, and the actual dangers of this pull is heavily dictated by what jobs you have in your party. For example, if your healer happens to be a scholar, your healer has way more healing throughput than any other healer in this level range, assuming you have to spam heal the tank constantly, which you might. And if your DPS players are machinists especially, then they have the most potent filler AoE in this level range as well. In terms of tanking advantage, Warrior and Paladin have slightly more burst with Berserk and Fight or Flight, and Gunbreaker has better defense with Camouflage, and Dark Knight has the best consistent damage simply with Unleash. A particular thing that makes the Sastasha Mega Pull a lot easier than you'd think it is the simple fact that the distance from your starting point to your destination is enormous, which gives your group a lot of time to gradually deal with the mobs as you run, as long as your DPS players can attack while running. Meaning, hopefully it is not a summoner, as Black Mage at least has Scathe and Red Mage has Riposte, even if they aren't that great. Normally, a really long run can be a massive concern, but this is mostly if the mobs can shoot, which they cannot here. Finally, one particular concern that is a huge problem if you cannot get rid of the mobs as you go is the Jerk Anglerfish as you near the end. This mob can apply a damage boost to all nearby mobs, so if there are many remaining by the time it casts this, you can suddenly find yourself going from a difficult fight to an impossible fight. The buff does not have a cast time. Number 9. Kata's Cry. The last section of the dungeon specifically. Normally, the sheer distance between packs tends to make groups at least split this up in 2 parts or even 3. However, several of the mobs have sudden tank busters within a warning, effectively doubling their damage output at times. And some even have telegraphed attacks, so when you do the full pull from start to finish, even wilder if you actually choose to bring it all into the room with the Chimera, then this can get extremely hectic. The random explosions as you run can also cause a lot of trouble actually pulling all of these mobs without being put in danger in the first place. In this level range, barrier healers once again have an advantage due to being able to apply shields instantly or being able to heal passively while running, and also being able to double down on healing alongside the pet in the case of Scholar. For DPS, it is mostly the same again, with jobs like Machinist and Dancer being particularly strong, but most melee DPS also come online with their AoE at this level, with Ninja having both Death Blossom and Katon by now. For tanks, Dark Knight or Gunbreaker are probably your best bets, although the offensive power difference between the 4 tanks stays reasonably within reach of each other. Number 8. Stone Vigil. I know I said I wouldn't include anything that I had already covered in the previous video, but Stone Vigil has 3 mega pulls that you don't always see that I really want to highlight just due to the sheer insanity of these pulls. You can pull everything from the start of the dungeon into the boss room for the first boss. Similarly, you can pull everything from there to the second boss room. And of course, if you have someone to open the door for you, or if you run fast enough yourself, then you can open the door to the final boss. and pull everything into that boss room. Also, little bonus fun fact, the Avis dragon creatures in the areas after the second boss apparently can be snuck past and are technically optional if you can sneak behind them. What makes these gigapulls so insanely brutal is that all of them include either Dravanian outflyers or ice sprites, or a mix, and they are both ranged, meaning that your tank is going to get chunked while they round up the mobs. This means that due to the distance you need to run to round up this many mobs, it is almost a requirement to bring a barrier healer, perhaps even specifically a sage, or at least not a white mage, as their lack of any instant healing makes it pretty much impossible to manage. In this level range, all DPS jobs have AoEs as well, so there are no particular preferences, although jobs like Machinist or Dancer may still be preferred. Ninja's Katon can also still be very effective due to the sheer burst potential. Warrior is the only tank with an invulnerability option in this dungeon, so they might be preferred for these kinds of insane megapulls as well. And just in case anyone was wondering, I do not recommend pulling trash packs into a boss room unless you have a full pre-made that are all in on it. Number 7. Dzemael Darkhold. In particular, the pull after the first boss. Now, I imagine most people think I'm thinking of two separate pulls here, but technically, you can pull everything up to the boss room. Personally, before actually doing it myself, I didn't feel confident that it might even be reliably possible to do this full wall-to-wall pull. However, the primary reason for that lack of confidence is first of all that there are these souls barraging you with attacks as you pull, and they just won't get into the blob of enemies, so even if you cleave everything else, they will still be there. And secondarily, but honestly more importantly, the second pack here has a jerk anglerfish, which puts a physical vulnerability debuff on the tank that might not be super brutal, but is brutal enough that it warrants being removed. In fact, so much so that I believe if you actively plan to do this pull, you would be well served bringing a bard to use Warden's Paean, and the damage output of a bard is comparable enough to a Machinist and Dancer due to Army's Paean and Mage's Ballad, alongside the newly learned Reign of Death that I'm pretty sure you cannot tell the difference between these three jobs in damage. Other general concerns of this mega pull are the Nixes, the toads, which can just drag you around, which could absolutely lead to a sudden death situation. Number 6. Aurum Vale. Now, again, I did say I wouldn't do repeats, but I do want to highlight Aurum Vale's hardest pull as also the dumbest pull, because you have no reason to do this. Genuinely, it gives no additional experience now, so you really shouldn't bother. However, pulling the entire first room is technically something you could do if you were bored. This includes 2 Nixes, which will drag you randomly and do an AoE, 8 Lilies, which will attack you from range, 4 Wasps, and 8 Eft-Stools, which will regularly use a tank buster for double damage. Also, be careful with the yellow goop on the floor, as that does a lot of damage too. Not to mention, some of the mobs can sometimes just choose to reset randomly. If you think this is too easy, remember that you can also pull the boss. With that, we move on over to pulls that are a lot more normal, but still scary to a significant amount of players, so that we don't spend the entire video in A Realm Reborn. Number 5. Baelsar's Wall. In particular, the pull at the very start. With a very open courtyard, you can pick up 3 whole packs and also 3 singular mobs that tends to be stronger even on their own, which happens to include the Magitech Sky Armor that sort of just adds itself to the first pack at the start. The chain from said armor can also easily divert attention because it isn't entirely obvious what exactly that chain does at a glance. It's damage. There's quite a mix of mobs, and the run isn't very long honestly, which leads to a lot of the things that made big AoE pulls surprisingly easy among other examples like Sastasha being completely absent here. Most of the mobs are probably very healthy by the time you reach your destination. Also, most of the mobs being either ranged or having a sort of tank buster or even a dot also just adds to the pull's capacity to overwhelm an unprepared tank. For this particular pull, of course, the best tank to bring is a warrior given raw intuition. If the warrior is well prepared for that, then it doesn't really matter what other jobs you choose to bring. Any other tank can probably also manage it, but it will be a lot harder. As we progress up in higher levels, this will be more about technique rather than possibility, given that large AoE pulls become more limited. The rest of the dungeon is very segmented or spaced out, making the AoE pulls less interesting for this list. Number 4. Shisui of the Violet Tides. Specifically, the mega pull right after the first boss. Once again, we're looking at a combined 4 packs of 3 mobs each. Most, if not all of them, also have mini tank busters. 2 of the mobs are also ranged, however, that is not particularly important as the ranged mobs are in the last pack you pull, removing their ability to snipe at you during the pulling part. Overall, this is a somewhat feared pull as it is manageable enough that an average group expects to be able to do it, however, not all tank players or healer players are actually capable of keeping up with the damage. And sometimes your group's combined damage output might also just not be good enough to make it before you all run out of juice. However, this pull can be done by a lone warrior, which is more a testament to how low the sustained damage is while someone is running away from the pack. Number 3. Doma Castle. This both includes the big second pull of the dungeon, which includes this Colossus, but also includes the mega pull after the first boss. Now, what makes the big pull with the Colossus scary is that the Colossus on its own has an extremely nasty tank buster that it can use at range. It also has a very large frontal telegraph that can catch you off guard. This is certainly not helped by the airships that just do a lot of damage, but a single mob with an actually brutal tank buster with no warning sign can easily sneak up on a healer especially. The mega pull after the first boss is a weird beast because it is sort of expected by a lot of players and yet is also feared by a lot of players because of the awkwardness of the pull itself. It is one of, if not the longest wall-to-wall pull in the game, which is then slowed down further by the telegraphs and the cannons along the way, forcing you to halt every so often. All of this culminates in a situation where, if your DPS players are actively wearing down the mobs as you go, you will often not even have the entire pull alive by the time you pull the last few. On the other hand, if your group is not making a significant effort to cleave the mobs as you go, you will find this might be one of the hardest pulls in the game. I believe the Pugsnax mobs among them have a tank buster, but with the sheer quantity of mobs, it all ends up blending together, and what ultimately matters is there are a lot of things here. Number 2. Mhigo. Here, we are specifically looking at the mega pull after the first boss. The Avengers, the gorilla-looking things, have tank busters, and I believe the rearguard robot does too. It is possible even the Pugsnax do, but due to the sheer quantity of them, this can be difficult to say for sure. This is once again one of those pulls that are manageable enough that it isn't too rare to see in a random group, but it is also dangerous enough that it can easily go wrong, making it very similar to Shisui of the Violet Tides in that people know that it is common to do it, but might not be confident in actually doing it. And finally, number 1, Anamnesis Anyder. This dungeon has an additional super awkward pull halfway to the second boss because of the quantity of casters that a tank would need to pull in unusual ways to actually AoE properly. However, the real star of this particular dungeon is possibly the quintessential example of some of the previous dungeons of an awkward but commonly doable mega pull that a lot of players are scared of. I am, of course, talking about the mega pull after the second boss. On the one hand, we have mobs that are actively summoning more mobs and are explicitly not following you, suggesting you should stay and fight them. On the other hand, you could simply let them do that and pull everything. There are a total of 4 packs, with 3 of them having summoners, and then just deal with those adds when they arrive. The true difficulty of this pull really boils down to whether you use an AoE limit break to shorten the fight or not. If you don't, then it is a very real possibility that the tank and healer will genuinely run out of juice. However, if you do use an AoE limit break, it can almost completely trivialize this pull. An additional difficulty of this particular AoE pull is also the variety of mobs in the pull itself. The summoners also using ranged attacks can also make it difficult to properly clump all the mobs up to cleave well, further extending the length of the fight. However, because this pull comes right after a boss, and the final boss comes right after that, it is very likely everyone has most of their buttons ready to go, allowing everyone to use everything they have, which may sound a little familiar as it is sort of the inverse of the problem of Bottom's Metal, which was a dungeon I mentioned in the previous list. Finally, I just want to add that back when this dungeon was current in Expert Roulette, I knew several players that refused to tank it simply because of the awkwardness of this pull. That might sound weird, but that should at least say something about how scary or annoying it might feel to a significant amount of players. Something you may have noticed with these dungeons is that as they were ordered from lowest level to highest, the magnitude of difficulty of the dungeons seemed to reduce, while the expectation to do said megapulls were increased, which changed the danger of megapulls from being the sheer impossibility of doing them with strangers, to being the genuine real possibility that you would have to do them with strangers. This is simply a result of more streamlined dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV as we progress to newer content. With that said, I would still love to hear about the craziest megapulls you know about, even if they make no sense to do like the Aurum Vale one. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, once Warrior learns Raw Intuition, the only real limiter on what kinds of AoE pulls a warrior can solo with diligent use of kiting is how many ranged enemies are in the pack, as the warrior is perfectly capable of resetting their HP to full every 25 seconds. This of course also means that most dungeons after level 56 are already significantly easier to do if you simply bring a warrior.